Good evening, everyone. Tonight's a very special night because we have Alexander Neef with us here tonight. And a couple of you have heard the story before, but I like it so much that I'll just tell it again. So my friend and I, we decided to go to this Massey lecture on the arts in Canada about a year and a half ago. And we wanted to go because we're both fans of ballet, and Karen Kane was speaking on the panel. I didn't care about anybody else. There was someone from the theater, there was, I don't know, what was a Neef? I had never heard of this before. And in true U of T style, I was sprinting towards the campus, completely and utterly late, sat in the back, and the panel had just barely begun. And I was very surprised at what I found. Karen Kane was elegant and brilliant, of course, but there was this other person, our German friend from the Canadian Opera Company. And my friend dared me to talk to him. So afterwards, I was wading through the crowd and I thought, oh no, he's heading for the door, I'll never meet him now. And the crowd parted and there he was. So I greeted him in German and swiftly ran out of German and thought, well, oh no, I need to keep engaging him, what do I do? So I just spit out every problem I thought with the arts sector in Canada, and it seemed to go fairly well. But just then, a little old lady walked in between us, pretended that I wasn't even there, and started just talking your ear off. And we looked at each other and we looked at her and thought, oh, this is exactly the problem that we were talking about. No one is listening to the new generation. And that is how the idea for Salon West was born. So it's been quite the year. It only took a year and a half to get you here. But
you've pulled off the salon.
Yes.
So, to your credit.
Well, we've had a running joke that you've attended every single salon, so...
In spirit.
You know, like the Phantom of the Opera or something. So I'm so happy to have you here, and some members of your board were very instrumental in tonight, in that some of them, they work for Burgundy Asset Management, and they were kind enough to be our presenting sponsors for the evening, so things are looking up. We didn't have to do everything scraping as a bootstrap project. So, you know, I'm really encouraged and so happy that you're here. But you're in the hot seat, I should let you know.
It's all right. It happens.
It happens. Someone's got to ask the tough questions. So, I mean, opera is seen as this very exclusive art form, a very Western European art form. You know, I could use less diplomatic language, but we'll stop it there.
You wanted to make this a hot seat, so
it's hard to let go of my diplomatic nature, especially with you. But I'm curious about how you feel about how opera has changed, and if it can go different places, and the diversity question. I mean, we see these contemporary aesthetics on stage, and if it's believable to have the marriage of Figaro with a giant red piano that people are hopping in and out of, why is it not believable to have a more multicultural and diverse cast that's reflective of the city where we're putting on these operas? Also, when you have such a powerful and, I think, complete art form that has music and instruments and dance and theater, I mean, you have something very powerful at your disposal, and you can reach people at a level further than words. So I'm wondering if you think this can be a force for good in our country and in our community. One last
I mean, a force for good, that's big. But, you know, I would agree with you that it's a very powerful art form. And it's powerful because it brings together so many different things. It brings together music, obviously, theater, visual arts. And what I find even more important is that it tells very basic stories. And that's where it really stops being Western European for me.
Okay.
Because the stories that we tell are so basic that I think they translate in very easily in different cultural backgrounds. And when you look at opera today, there's opera all over the world.
That's true.
And it's not only done, obviously it comes from, Italy, and then it spreads to other countries, over the course of 400 years. But there's really not only people attending opera and people producing opera, but also people studying opera and training to be an orchestra musician or an opera singer or a stage technician, a director, a rehearsal pianist, all over the world. And in a country like Canada, where it really doesn't have a 400-year history, more of a less than 100-year history, I think that's a real opportunity because we don't really. I don't feel that there is a weight that pulls us down, like the weight of history. I mean, before I came here to run the COC, I was the casting director at the Paris Opera, which obviously is a very prestigious old institution that's was founded in I think 1661 or something.
That's a while ago.
It's a while ago, and it gives you a lot of weight in a good way because it provides a lot of legitimacy. It always was part of the official culture, the representation of the court, and then later when there was no court anymore, it just became part of what was the public cultural routine in a way. But tradition always has two sides.
Yes.
It can be an inspiration, or it can be something that pulls you down and doesn't allow you to move. And I don't really think we have that here. So I take that as an opportunity to just put it out. And obviously, it doesn't exist where we don't do it.
Yeah.
So, and we do it here in Toronto as, first of all, we do it as 21st century people for 21st century people.
Okay.
But in a way, most of the people that we work with come from here. So if you want it or not, that informs the way we do it. Maybe more on a subconscious than a conscious level, but it's very much about people from this community doing it for people of this community, with the help of guests that kind of stir the pot and make it a little bit more international. But it's more about bringing themselves into this community than imposing themselves on this community. I think that's something that would be very important to me.
Right. And you have some new Canadian productions.
Well, yeah, I mean that was part of the process of my own personal immersion into this community. I always thought it would be important to develop Canadian work, but I didn't want to do it as a token. I didn't want to do it for the purpose of doing it.
Right.
I wanted to do it because we believed that it was meaningful and important. And I think we're at a point where I have immersed myself enough into this community to put a few Canadian works out for discussion. And we have 4 lined up over the next 5 years, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
It's a pretty strong commitment. And we'll see what happens after. There's a lot of other things that are in discussion. None of them is kind of ready to be launched yet, but I think the fact that we have announced those 4 projects has given us a really big boost, and people kind of feel that we are maybe more interested than they thought we were, and that we have a certain level of commitment to, first of all, having discussions about new work and new Canadian work, but also that we're ready to follow through on it.
Right. Well, tonight there's Pyramus and Thisbe. So, what makes this production different and important? There's been a lot of buzz about it.
Which I'm very happy about. It's in many ways a very unusual project. It's the first new Canadian work that we've presented at the COC since 1999. It's the first world premiere of not only a Canadian work, the first world premiere of anything that we've presented at the Four Seasons Centre, which has been around for almost 10 years. So that makes me very proud that we were able to pull that off. It's a very unusual piece in a way that I compare it to very contemporary painting or very contemporary literature in a way that it has a different way of dealing with narrative. It kind of doesn't have that, linear narrative that we're used too from theater and opera for hundreds of years. It kind of takes that for granted. It takes for granted that you kind of know that the story of Pyramus and Thisbe is like the original Romeo and Juliet
Right.
of the two lovers that can't come together. So it's more of a reflection on that. And when the when the score first arrived on my desk, I liked the theme because it's a very operatic theme. Like love is one of the big themes in opera. I thought it was clever of a composer to choose a story that actually works in opera. I like that. And then when I got into reading the music, reading the libretto, I realized that Barbara Monk-Feldman had also very cleverly, intelligently chosen how to tell that story in a non-narrative, non-linear way. In fact, that she chose almost like meditations on the theme of unfulfilled love, with those three main texts that she chose from Faulkner and St. John of the Cross and Rilke. So I just really liked that in a way that her thinking was so modern. And not only that her, the language of her music and the way she wrote score, but the whole thinking that she had put into that piece was so incredibly contemporary.
Yeah. Speaking of contemporary ways of looking at old stories, last season's Don Giovanni was quite the conversation piece.
It still is.
Yes,
still is.
Yes, it still is. Now,
that's why we're still talking about it.
That's right. Well, the opposite of my question of whether or not opera can be a force for good is, well, when I walked out of Don Giovanni, I thought opera, well, that production was a source for evil.
The force of evil.
Well, I mean, its interpretation of the story was the rape scene is always very challenging, I think, for any director. But the interpretation seemed to say that was almost apologetic, almost justifying it, that she wanted this to happen. And I had attended a panel with the director.
You mean at the very beginning?
Yes. Yeah. There was a panel with the director, and he too had this very problematic perspective about that assault. And
yeah, I mean that's the way you look at it. I mean, we could have a very long conversation about this, but the great thing is, it's actually to the point of what we try to achieve with any art that we put on our stage. You have to make sense of it. You're not like I always say. I don't run a school, and I don't run a museum.
Okay.
Like, of course, we want to do things in an historically informed way, but that doesn't really mean that we just reproduce the past. That would also be very difficult in the case of Don Giovanni because we don't have any information about what the original production of it looked like. We know who the singers were, and we have some information, but it was also performed in a very small theater. I think the original experience of Don Giovanni in Prague, 1780 something, is very difficult from anything we could do today. And obviously the piece at the time had a certain meaning, a certain impact for an 18th century audience. How do you translate that into an experience for a 21st century audience that has a completely different background, a completely different view on things? And also, how literal do you take a libretto? Because as we know, any art means something. It looks like something and it might mean something else. So that's where the interpretative process comes into play. And it's the director's job, and it's the singer's job, it's the conductor's job, and it's also your job as a member of the audience. Because we will just put out a suggestion, and in your case, you strongly disagree, which is as valid as strongly agreeing. And it's definitely better than being completely indifferent to it. So I will have to leave you with your opinion, gladly, if I may say.
That was a very diplomatic answer, but don't
I
you think
actually
there should
don't
be
think
some...
it's diplomatic because I can't solve your conundrum for you. Like, I can't validate your feeling, nor do I not want to validate it.
Maybe
Because you could say the opera. I think in a way, if there is a problem that you perceive a problem of the production, it's usually a problem that's already a problem of the opera.
Okay.
You know, and Don Giovanni might be one thing. I think an incredibly problematic piece is something like Madame Butterfly.
Also problematic.
Very problematic.
Very problematic.
Nobody would have thought anything 100 years ago. Today, and not only in a multicultural city like Toronto, very problematic. Yet, still one of the best-selling operas ever. And you could ask the question why.
Well, you can't argue with the music.
Well, but yeah, see, are you actually forgiving the unacceptable content because you like the music? I would find that very problematic. You know, I think people should come to Butterfly and they should enjoy the drama of it, but they should also be moved and in a way repelled by it.
All right, well, a step removed.
That usually doesn't happen. And it's interesting why. You know, in a way, what's so interesting about Puccini is that the way he writes music, it's highly manipulative. Like he tells you with the music and he guides you with the music who are the good guys and the bad guys in the opera. Mozart never does that, nor does Verdi. Mozart doesn't judge his personality, his characters. He just puts them out for discussion. And you know, you can have all kinds of opinions about Donna Anna and Don Giovanni, and I can probably validate most of them from the piece, because the piece doesn't actually tell us if Don Giovanni is the bad guy or the good guy, nor does the piece tell us if Donna Anna actually consented or not.
Yeah.
It's before the opera starts. So you have to make that decision for yourself, because the opera will not explain it to you.
Okay. All right. So one step removed is, do you think that you, as director of the Canadian Opera Company or any other director of an opera company, should be mindful of some of these unforgivable messages or unforgivable stories that are put on our stages?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, yes. I mean, there's things that I think are not acceptable. I mean, that's what happens even before the rehearsal process starts. But also during the rehearsal process, I would always look. What's important to me is that I can always justify to my audience why we do the things we do. That doesn't mean that we have to agree on all of them. But when I can't defend something that happens on our stage, I will make myself known.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to respect the creative process, but in the end, I'm responsible for what we put on our stage. And you know, you do that. By the way, how you select the pieces that you perform, but also how you see them through to opening night.
Right. So, since we're pressed for time, maybe we should.
Is it time for the game?
Well, I'll ask
Not
you,
the game,
you
our
first.
game.
Our game. We have a great game. Well, what do you want to do? Do you want to ask some questions or play my fabulous opera trivia game? Any takers?
Please.
Do you do anything to get your audiences ready for the new works you're going to be presenting, since it's such a shift from the programming you've done in the past?
Well, we always do for everything we do. There's a lot of content always available on our website. We send things to people before they attend. The only problem with that is I can't make them read it. I think there's a lot of content available, but again, if you're not ready to engage, there's very little I can do for you. I can only provide the material, and I think there's quite a lot available for everything we do. And obviously, if something is a little bit more difficult, we would try to provide content that make things clearer. But in the end, intellectual involvement, I think, is a prerequisite to interact with art. Like, if you're not ready to engage, it's probably not going to do a lot for you. And that's also a decision that you make. And it's a decision that I or we can't make for you. In the end, it's your personal predisposition to engage with any given work of art, and be it like one of the paintings here, or an opera or a play or whatever it is, I mean, the advantage of a painting always is that if it doesn't speak to you right away, or you don't like it, you can walk over to the next painting. I mean, the situation in theater is that you need to stay at least until intermission. And that, people tend not to leave in the middle of a show. And that's a good thing, but I guess if you don't find an entry point, you will sit there with growing frustration. And it might make you very angry. In the same way, if you find an entry point, you might find it an incredibly rewarding experience. And I can kind of guide you to that entry point, but I cannot make you walk through the door. So it's very much a take and give process. And it's a lot about openness too. I mean, there's things, and I know that from my own opera and theater going experience, I'm no different. When I go to see things somewhere else, I'm a member of the audience like anyone else, and I have no advantage. I mean, obviously I have an advantage for my own shows because I produce them and I'm very intimately involved in the creative process. But when I go somewhere else, I usually know no more than anybody else who is there. And it happens to me. If I don't find that door, I get frustrated or I get very engaged if I find the door. So. But I've tried to train myself to kind of fight the frustration when it happens and say, okay, maybe there is something that I'm not getting, and maybe there's something I need to find here that will bring me into the show. But for us as producers, it's difficult. I think if we lose a member of the audience in the first 10 minutes, we need to work super hard to bring them back into the game. That's just the process. And so for something a little bit more difficult, I just would hope that people come with a slightly more open mind, and that they would also, engage with us after the fact. What we'll do for something like Pyramids and Thisbe, we'll do a couple of post-show talks that I will do, and Johannes Davis, our music director, will do for the audience to come and after the fact help them to clarify some things, or just have an open conversation about it. Obviously, there's a pre-performance talk for every single performance we do, which is attended by a lot of people. So I think there are tools, but people come to me very often and say, I'm going to my first opera. What do I have to prepare? And I think that's one of the big misunderstandings about opera. Knowledge doesn't necessarily provide you with an advantage, because the connection happens emotionally in the first place, and I think it needs to be emotional first and intellectual second. I think both are equally necessary, but if you don't connect to it emotionally and it's only an intellectual exercise, you're not going to get a lot of enjoyment out of it. I think that's really important.
I've only been to a handful of operas at the Canadian Opera Company, but if I recall correctly, I believe all of them were set in modern times. So I had a couple of questions around that. Number one is, would the opera consider in the future doing something more traditionally set? And I believe, if I recall correctly again, that when the director of the TSO was at the Salon, he was, I believe, talking about a tension between ticket sales and doing things that are more modern. And I was just wondering if you had a sense of whether there's that tension in opera as well, or perhaps the reverse, or...
Well, I don't think we have a dogmatic approach to production style. I would not want anyone to think that, because I think it's really the piece that determines the way you do it. And we would check very carefully for every piece we do, what is the right way of doing it for our audience. Now that's not, there's no recipe for success, which makes it difficult, makes it also more interesting. If everybody knew how to do everything successfully, it would be a very boring art form. But it's interesting. I think there is a crucial role that the 19th century plays in theater and opera becoming something that's seen as historic. And because when you go further back, I feel like when opera started in the 17th century, in no way different from theater back to its very origins in Athens 2,500 years ago, for the longest time, the people on stage would never look any different from the audience. Like in Shakespeare's time, the actors on stage were in Elizabethan costume. It's just that it wasn't a costume in the day. They looked like the audience. They would have, maybe some fancy wig, some fancy hat, or some props that were not, daily life props, or a mask or whatever. But in the end, no audience member would have found it strange that the people look the same on stage. And I think that was very much the case still in Mozart's time, but what's so interesting about Mozart is that for some of his later operas, he started choosing contemporary subjects. And that was a big departure from older theater, where it was mostly about gods and heroes, and not about, Don Giovanni was a contemporary subject, Marriage of Figaro a contemporary subject, Così fan tutte a contemporary subject. So very, in a way, a departure, and that I think that departure was motivated by the Enlightenment and by the ideas essentially that led to the French Revolution. And all of a sudden, theater didn't look contemporary only. It became truly contemporary. And then in a way, that's what made it dangerous for the powers. Because the world really changed once the French had, not only put their king off the throne, they also killed their own king. And all the established world order had really been turned over. And whereas the theater before that, nobody had really thought a lot about why theater was relevant or dangerous, or why the ideas that came into the theater would actually be powers of societal change. I think after the French Revolution, everything changed. And in a very dramatic way for the theater, because all of a sudden the ideas that were discussed in a public place, or the gathering of people in a public space, all of a sudden was nothing casual anymore. It became something that was potentially dangerous. And then, as you all now know, the French Revolution was a kind of a short-term success at first because it was suppressed, and then as we go into the 19th century, there was a big period of reaction. Where the old monarchies were reinstalled, and they tried very hard over the course of the 19th century to stay in power. But you can never turn back the wheel of history. Like the ideas, they couldn't kill the ideas. So they could, jail the revolutionaries and reinstall, the old order, but they couldn't get rid of the ideas. So all of a sudden, theater became something that was very tightly controlled. And I believe that censorship before the French Revolution was mostly religious. Like they would check that there were no religious symbols, no blasphemy on stage. There were certain periods of the year for the religious holidays when there was no theater allowed. But after the French Revolution, censorship became political, way more than it was religious. And that necessitated for the theater to not be contemporary anymore. And that's why we enter in the period of historicism, when all of a sudden everything plays in the past. Nothing plays in our day-to-day anymore. And the one really interesting figure in that respect is Verdi, who actually wrote a few highly contentious operas that were difficult for the censors to manage. One of them is Masked Ball, which brings the murder of a king on stage, which obviously post-French Revolution was something that was really a courageous choice for a subject. And what did the censors do? They made him change it. They turned the King of Sweden into the governor of Boston, and they moved the action from the late 18th century to somewhere in the 17th century, and set that whole thing within the Puritan community in New England, which of course made it completely absurd. Another piece that suffered from the censors was Rigoletto, which again, Rigoletto was based on a play by Victor Hugo about King Francis of France, who, even though he was a 17th century king, even a 16th century king, had quite some roguish behavior, and Verdi planned on putting that play on stage as an opera. The censors wouldn't allow him to put the King of France on stage. They made him, transform the King of France into some minor duke of a minor Italian duchy. So I mean, that's just two examples. Another great example is Traviata. When Verdi wrote Traviata in the mid 1850s, he wanted it to be a piece about morals in the mid 1850s. And the census made him move it backwards 150 years, so that it was less of his time. So, and Verdi, through Traviata and other pieces, became a very famous composer, and it took him about 30 years until the 1880s to impose the performance conditions for his operas, and he always insisted that Traviata was performed as a contemporary opera in a contemporary setting. So, what does that mean for us today? When we take a piece like Traviata, a piece like Marriage of Figaro, how do we perform that? Do we leave it in what would have been Mozart's time and remove it from our own? Do we pull it into our own time and make it very contemporary? Or do we set it in any time period in between? Because I think we have that possibility, but we need to make that decision. We can't just say, that's what it was in Verdi's time, we do it exactly the same way. Because it kind of doesn't respect what he would have wanted for that piece, or the way he would have seen that piece. And it's a problem that's in a way unsolvable, because the piece is not of our time, and yet it is,
So, you've been putting on operas in Toronto for almost a decade now. So, what have you learned at the helm of the COC? What have been your biggest challenges?
I don't know. I don't look at them as challenges. I look at them as problems to be solved. I think we have an incredible opera community here. I think the audience is extremely curious, and they're ready to discuss. I think they don't judge it before they've seen it, which I find really important and refreshing. And I think they're ready to go a long way. And I think they also try really hard to follow us and understand why we do what we do. Then, sometimes you succeed more or less, depending on what it is and depending on what the setup of that audience, that very night is. I think it's also, you can't treat the audience as the audience.
Okay.
I always say there's 2,000 audiences every night. Because everyone will walk out of that show with a slightly different idea of what it was. And
all right.
so in a way, I think it's very hard you don't want to do it against or without the audience, but you cannot really do it for them either. I think it's more about putting out a strong proposal, and yet it's only a proposal. I think there's there's a lot of wrong ways of doing things, but I think there's not one right way. But I think we need to stand behind it and say that is what our Don Giovanni is, or that was what our Traviata is. That doesn't mean that it's the truth about Don Giovanni or Traviata. It's just one of the many possibilities of doing it. And I think that's important for the audience to know, that you come back a couple of years later, it's a different production. It might be completely different. It might lead you down a completely different way. But I believe it's all in the piece. Or it's all in the pieces. It's the pieces that allow us to have those opportunities. And we still perform them because they're multi-layered and they actually allow us to do this with them.
Right.
When you look at, we're very lucky that today we have access to 400 years of works. And most of the ones that we perform today are the masterpieces that have it's very Darwinist in a way. It's the survival of the best. And they don't only survive because of the pretty music, I think they survive because they also have a strong story to tell.
Right.
When you look at how many of Mozart's contemporaries we still perform, not so many. How many of Verdi's contemporaries we still perform, not so many. I mean, I think people like Mozart and Verdi were a real problem for their fellow composers in their own time, because they were so, not only one head, but several feet above what other people are able to do. And that's why we still find interest in those works today.
So, obviously you need to stand by your various productions, but is there anything you wish you had done differently since coming to Toronto and within your work at the opera company?
I mean, I always do that with my team when we're done with the run. We always talk about what worked and what didn't, and what would we do differently next time. Absolutely. I mean, that's part of the process, but it's also part of the process that after Aslan, you're never done. Like if I ever felt I was done with a piece, I would not program it anymore. And that's an individual thing because other people might still not be done with it. So, I mean, there's probably something in every production that sometimes it can be music related, sometimes it can be staging related, but it's not a bad thing. I mean, the people who trained me in opera, they trained me to always strive for the best possible, outcome or best possible goal that you could reach. But in a way, this can only work if you set a new goal shortly before you've reached your goal. Otherwise, it's not a fulfilling process, and I think you have to kind of grow with your own standards.
Right. I'll pretend you answered the question.
Thank you.
There's nothing in particular that you can reflect on that you wish you did differently?
No, I mean not in terms of putting on the shows. I mean, obviously when I came here, my first 2 seasons were partly prepared, so there's only so much jurisdiction that I had over those. But ever since we've done the programming that I was responsible for, I feel pretty good about it. And that doesn't mean I would do it exactly the same. But it was, I think we've done okay.
I think you've
This
done
place-
okay too.
Yeah.
That idea you spoke about art being dangerous, I just think that's an exciting idea. And does it motivate you in how you create opera? Do you think the opera can be dangerous? Because I think most people don't view it as a particularly dangerous form of art.
Well, I mean, dangerous is obvious as a range to dangerous and subversive and all those words. But when you go back to a production like Don Giovanni, I think what it shows you really is the self-destruction of a human being for the sake of the pursuit of absolute freedom. And I find that dangerous and shocking. And I think and that's when you go back to the origins of theater and Greek tragedy. I think that was the purpose. That they wanted to show the community examples of how really things can go wrong, and then take that out of the community because you would allow an outlet. In a way, when you look at Oedipus and all those very strong, basic stories, essentially what they tried to provide the community with was an outlet for that not to happen in the community. So in a way, it's not about being dangerous only, it's also about the cathartic process that then allows you not to do that in life. And I think that's very interesting about the theater. I mean, it only happens when there is a congregation of people that experience that together. You usually don't have that experience when you're alone in your living room. And I think that's also what makes, obviously, the Greek theaters were built to accommodate the number of free citizens in that city. We can't quite build opera houses that large today. Also, everybody had to go. Like, the tragedies, the performances of the tragedies were part of religious festivals, and businesses were closed, and people went to the theater. So it's not quite what it is today anymore. It's a little bit more, commercial. But I think it's still, at the core, it's the idea of it. And I'd like to believe that's why we're still there. Also in an age where most media that we consume are prepackaged and really hard to understand in 2 different ways. I think what the theater affords you as a member of the audience is a choice. You sit there and you actually have to like Don Giovanni or not. And you have to, if you don't want to look at Don Giovanni because you don't like him, you can look at so many things all night and you can ignore him. I think there's no other medium than the theater that affords you to do that again. And I think it empowers you as a member of the audience, and I think that sense of empowerment and sense of ownership is very important.
But I think when you spoke of danger, you meant it originally more in terms of danger to social structure and power.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit different today. Obviously, when we talk about Verdi in the 1850s, he didn't really live in a democracy. I mean, like, we have a lot of civic freedom and liberties that didn't exist in the 19th and 20th century. So in a way, you know, I would say this is a free country and it's a good thing. So we don't have to be that subversive anymore in the theater, because we can have those discussions more in the open. But still, I mean, as the individual relates to society, there's still a lot of unresolved problems.
So it still motivates.
Yeah, I think it should. You know, and then of course, depending on the piece, the Barber of Seville will motivate you a little bit less than something that's a little bit more pertinent. But it's just the range that the art form affords you. So again, I always say it's not opera, it's operas. It's pieces, and every piece is different, and every piece will have a different impact on you. It might have a different impact on your seat neighbor.
Well,
I'll be out of time.
we have to let you go.
To get to my Pyramus and Thisbe?
Yes.
I do.
Yeah. We'll play trivia next time.
We'll play trivia next time, yes.
But thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And yeah, let's give it a round. Cool.
Thank you, it was fun.
That was cool.